Welcome to the smartest people in the room, or better said, breakfast at Spitter, or Simon and Simon Says. Regardless of the name, we are glad you are here, and just by showing up, you are already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I am pleased to present two people who are longtime friends. Both are British and who have made their mark on the international stage in several lanes of the music industry. And I promise you will leave smarter and more enlightened than you arrived. Before we get started, please let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. But the second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones. And please ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those directly during the session. Also, and this is very important, please make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the host and speakers. I want to thank our program sponsors, for without their support, we could not keep this series free. Special thanks to First Horizon Bank, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Tennessee Brew Works, Better Than Booze. Also, MedJet, a special sponsor that I want to talk about because these guys are global travelers themselves. MedJet is something that you need to know about if you travel, especially internationally. Travel insurance only gets you to the nearest acceptable hospital. MedJet memberships get you moved home if you are ever in need on the road. So if you travel, especially internationally, you need to know all about MedJet. Let's get down to business. Today, I am excited to introduce my dear friend and music industry hero, Ralph Simon. For the 13th time, Ralph is hosting one of these sessions. Amazing. Ralph has enjoyed a spectacular 30-year career in a variety of prominent fields: the music business, media and entertainment, mobile smartphone technology and content, exponential medicine, and health, and leading-edge 21st century education systems. He began his career playing in a band, then co-founding the Zomba group of music and publishing companies and the Jive Records label in the 1970s, building it into the world's leading independent music and publishing businesses. Artists developed by Zomba and Jive include Britney Spears, the Backstreet Boys, Justin Timberlake, Will Smith, Billy Ocean, A Tribe Called Quest, and many others. In the mid-90s, he relocated to the U.S. and was appointed Executive Vice President of Capitol Records and Blue Note Records, and helped break new recordings by Radiohead, the Beastie Boys, the Beach Boys, Pink Floyd, the Beatles, and more. Ralph is one of the founders of the global mobile entertainment and mobile social media industry, a visionary and consistent innovator, and is popularly known as the father of the ringtone. These days, he globetrots as an in-demand investor and advisor to top media and entertainment companies while delivering keynote addresses at leading global conferences, while making an indelible mark as the music and tech industry's international ambassador of goodwill. Ralph, welcome back, my friend. It's such an honor to have you with us again.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that very extravagant intro, and just wonderful to be back, and most particularly with our very extra special guest today.
Well, let me tell you a little bit about our extra special guest. And joining Ralph is Simon Napier-Bell. Amongst the artists Simon has managed are the Yardbirds with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page, Asia, Japan, Sinead O'Connor, Ultravox, T-Rex, Mark Bolan, Candy Staton, Boney M, and Wham with George Michael. In the 60s, he co-wrote the song You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, a #1 for Dusty Springfield and later on Elvis Presley too. Simon has also written 4 best-selling books: You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, about the 60s, Black Vinyl, White Powder, about the post-war British record industry, I'm Coming to Take You to Lunch, about taking Wham to communist China in the 80s, and The Business, A History of the Business of Popular Music from 1710 until today, and Sour Mouth Sweet Bottom, a memoir. As director, he's made 4 major music documentaries. To Be Frank, Frank Sinatra at 100. 27 Gone Too Soon, about the 27 Club. 50 Years Legal, marking 50 years since the UK decriminalized homosexuality. And George Michael, A Portrait of an Artist. He's also the originating producer of Raiding the Rock Vault, the #1 rated music show in Las Vegas. It is my pleasure to welcome these 2 international rock stars to our platform today. Take it away, boys.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And Simon Napier-Bell, welcome, 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 all the way from Thailand? What the hell are you doing there?
Just around the corner from you in Indonesia. There we are.
That's true. No, but you spend a lot more time in Thailand, which has kind of become
It's home. I mean, I'd spend half my time all over the world like you do. But when I'm not all over the world, I come home, and home is Thailand.
And one of the things that I've been fascinated with you about is the fact that for you, traveling is not a luxury. Traveling is a necessity because you really need to get your thinking peaked by going and seeing and adventuring, and that stimulates this incredible reservoir of creativity that is you. Tell us a little bit about
That's what you just said about travel is true. I mean, several times in my life, hundreds of times, going right back to when I was a teenager or just left school, if I had a blank period or I felt depressed or I just felt I didn't know what to do next, I just got on a plane and went somewhere, or even those days on a train quite often. It's extraordinary how moving yourself from one environment to another can suddenly stimulate you or see something in a different light. Travel is an absolute necessity in my life and always has been.
So when you were in high school, you formed the first jazz band. You then left school at 17, and then with the idea of becoming a professional musician, preferably in America, but you couldn't get a visa, you decided at 18 to emigrate to Canada.
That's what I did. Yeah. I mean, I was obsessed with jazz from about the age of 11, 12 years onwards. Trad jazz at first, and then later I deliberately pushed myself to listen to modern jazz and then became obsessed with that. And I played the trumpet. I learned the trumpet. I formed a jazz band at school. It was hated by the school authorities, or by the headmaster anyway, who thought jazz was the devil's music. And that made me like it even better, of course. And I did intend to be, I mean, my plan was to become one of the world's great jazz musicians. And only when I finally arrived in North America, I realized that I might not actually get to that wonderful peak. And I ended up doing what most musicians do, which is earning living playing in bars and clubs and pop songs. I hadn't listened to a pop song since I was 11 years old. I suddenly got a job at 18 years old in a bar in Montreal where I had to play all the current pop songs. And I had to sit down the next 3 days and listen to every hit song that had been for the last 2 or 3 years. And I discovered something amazing, that pop is wonderful. Pop is poetry, it's artistry, it's wonderfully created. That the best songs are every bit as artistically integral to music as jazz is. And I was won over very much.
Well, it's just so interesting. I'm just looking at some of the people that are participating in our show today, and I can see Alan Walmark, highly respected A&R thinker and doer and signer of talent. Barry Evans from Britain, who's just very well known. Barry Coburn, the great manager from Nashville. We've got an interesting representative group. Also, Paul Zamek with us as well. And we'll give a shout out to quite a lot of you that have come into it. But Simon, I wanted to ask you a couple of things about the fact that you've also been, aside from writing books, you've been in the process of making films, documentaries and stuff, which we'll go through shortly. But for you, you always felt that rock came from a musical form of improvisation. And that really was something that attracted you as well.
Well, I'm making a film sort of about that now. My dad was a documentary film director, so that's sort of in my soul, is to make films. And I absconded to the music business for 30 years and have come back again. But I'm making a film currently, which is ostensibly about the Marquee Club, which is, you know, this extraordinary venue in London for 35 years, and was the host to everything which happened in the development of British rock, which really is rock. I mean, rock music is something which happened from England. And what most people find extraordinary is that it came from trad jazz, that the Marquee Club started as a jazz club. It featured trad jazz. And there's a direct lineage from trad jazz right through to rock, Dixieland jazz,
Oh, Dixieland.
The point is the musicians would take a break after 35, 40 minutes because their lips would get tired from blowing too hard. And they'd wave the rhythm section forward, who would then sing songs. And being a trad jazz or a Dixieland jazz band, the songs they sang were Southern blues, were Leadbelly, and things like Big Bill Broonzy and things like that. And this ended up there being a hit. And there was a hit in England with a song called Rock Island Line by the banjo player of the Chris Barber jazz band, Lonnie Donegan. And this utterly changed music in England. The year before Rock Island Line was a hit in England, which was 1953, in the whole of Britain, only 5,000 guitars had been sold, acoustic guitars. And the year after, 250,000 were sold. And there were 50,000, estimated 50,000 skiffle groups, which are kids from 13 to 15. If you could play an instrument, you joined the skiffle group. And every single rock group which we know of in England in the next 10 years emerged from having been in a skiffle group, whether it's the Beatles or the Roundbirds or the Stones or everybody. So it's a very, very fascinating story. And then as these skiffle groups earned a bit of money and they were able to buy a proper drum kit or electric guitars, they morphed into rhythm and blues, which is the obvious extension of being, a more professional version of skiffle. And for 5 years, England was completely overwhelmed with rhythm and blues. And these were the great groups we knew, like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds and the Animals. And then as they started writing their own songs, the music changed again. And they put into it the feelings and experience of young teenagers and the different lyrics which came from that as against the copycat American lyrics, and that was rock. And then rock went in all these different directions. And so this film really covers the whole of that story under the guise of being about the Marquee Club.
And so you're interviewing people that would have played on that famous stage at the Marquee, which really became a breeding ground for what then became the great golden era of British rock bands.
Well, they are. And the people at the beginning, of course, the people, many of whom have ended up at the end as major stars. But I'm not interviewing them. I mean, people like Elton John and Rod Stewart and Mick Jagger, I'm not talking to them about their life as major stars. I'm talking to them about that beginning stage of how they morphed from teenagers who first heard skiffle music into being R&B bands and then into rock stars. And that did all happen at the Marquee Club. It was the home to all this happening. So it's a wonderful project to have. I'm excited about it.
And so there's enough material there for you to find some interesting nuggets, not in the vaults, but from those individuals who recall some of the early days before you had a much more sophisticated live performance culture and environment.
Well, it's fascinating. We're talking to Brian Auger, who was in a band called the Steam Packet, which was a totally rhythm and blues, very, very good rhythm and blues band. And later he left the group and Elton John came in on keyboards that was renamed Bluesology. But what was fascinating is when we talked to Brian Auger and Elton too, their original influence to get them into piano playing was Winifred Atwell, who was a West Indian female pianist an emigrated to England who played ragtime music and had a couple of hits in England. And both of them had really been brought into the music, into piano playing by this woman, Winifred Atwell, in early 1950s. And it's fascinating to find this whole chain of events which led to rock. And really American rock was what came from the Marquee Club. It was British rock moved to America, and that was really rock music.
So bands like Yes, that also did cut some of their early teeth at the Marquee, and then of course Phil Collins and his band, the early formulation of
Genesis. Yeah, I mean Genesis and Yes and these bands. I mean, first of all, R&B morphed into rock as they started writing their own music, and then from rock, what happened was they went into all sorts of different directions. I mean, there was prog rock, which is you're talking about Genesis, and Yes, which is rather grand and brought in a lot of elements of classical music too, and went back to jazz as well. And there was a more rocky type of rhythm and blues, which is the Rolling Stones and the Animals. Later on, we had punk, we had heavy metal. They were all extremely different, and yet all came from the same source.
This is really so interesting. I'm pleased that we've got on the show today, we've got Dick Huey. Dick, who is a great musical professional. George Geese, also welcome, George. Great to see your name on the list. John Dolp, a producer in his own right. And so this is all really great. We'll do a shout out of some of the many others that have come in onto the show today. Simon, what I was keen to try and find out from you was about where you loved this whole idea of improvisation and found that that's what a great rock group does, notwithstanding the confines, say, of the rhythm and blues influence that influenced the Stones, that really did covers of some great R&B classics. But your whole view on improvisation and how that became rock.
There's a lot of talk about in the mid when I started managing the Yardbirds, which is 1966. The word rock didn't exist. There had been rock and roll, which is what we knew was rock and roll, which is Elvis Presley and Bill Haley. And all these groups who had guitars were called beat groups. And there was pop music and there was beat group music. And then the word rock began to be used by one or two journalists in the UK, that is rock without the roll, in 1966. I think journalist Chris Welsh was the first one to do it. And bit by bit, the word rock was used more and more. And to give you an example of how quickly it spread, at the beginning of 1967, there was the Monterey Pop Festival, the trendiest festival in the whole of America, called Monterey Pop Festival. By the time the film of the festival came out in Christmas of 1967, they changed the name. They called it the greatest rock concert ever. This name rock has swept across to America, and Rolling Stone, which is a new publication, latched onto it and started calling all these what we had called beat groups, started calling them rock groups. And it's very difficult to define the difference between pop and rock. But pop is really a beautifully, carefully crafted and composed song, beautifully framed and recorded, and never needs to be heard done a different way again. This is a pop song. It's a perfect creation, like a painting in a frame. And rock music is something much more freewheeling. It's a style, it's a lifestyle. It's a way of playing, a way of living in itself, which doesn't require, I mean, just like jazz, a rock song would start with the basic statement of the song, playing what it was, but then the groups go on to improvise their solos and to play at length. And the best rock concerts is not the same as it was last night. There are new things happen. New solos are played. They go on longer or shorter, and different things are sung. It is the derivation where it came from. It is because it was derived from jazz that it had this more free-flowing feel.
So interesting. I'm pleased to say we've got Adam Greenwell watching and listening from India. We've got Morten Dahlgren watching and listening from Malmö in Sweden. So we really traverse the whole world.
You've got Wim Reinen, who's probably in Belgium, but could be in Thailand, and Warren Campbell, who's almost certainly in Toronto.
Oh, wonderful.
A few other people. Yeah.
So this
getting around, aren't we?
The United Mutations of music lovers, all in one big dollop here with you, Simon. So great to see that. Simon, one of the things I wanted to just make mention of is these are some of the bands that you've managed over the years. Of course, Tom mentioned the Yardbirds, and the Yardbirds which bred Clapton and Jimmy Page. Mark Bolan, T-Rex, some great classic material that he wrote and had hits with before his car drove into a tree in which area of London? I can't quite recall. But nonetheless, you managed
Barnes Common.
Barnes Common, exactly. You managed Japan, the group, for about 7 years. You managed Sinead O'Connor, Ultravox, whose classic single Vienna was such a change maker. You regrouped Boney M. Boney M had some very big hits in their day. Sunita, a modern act. Wham, of course, with George Michael and Andrew Ridgeley, which we'll go to briefly, and also want to hear about China and how you managed to pull off that incredible achievement. And Candy Staton, who is really one of the great voices of all time. So you had this stable of people. Just give us
never a stable. It's just a long list of the people I've worked with. I love meeting young groups, young creative people, and helping them reach what they want. That's what I do best. I don't know whether I love it or not. It's just what I can do. I become very bored very quickly if I'm repeating the same thing. And once you've made a group successful, to be their manager really is a repetitive job year in, year out. Booking them, going round with them, dealing with the problems, and yes, making yourself $1 million or so a year, but utterly boring. And I found it very difficult to do. And so once groups are successful, my interest drifts away, and I look at new groups who are doing new things and aspiring to new things, which is why I continually change. They're not always new. Candy Stanton wasn't new. Candy Stanton simply came to me as a woman of her late 50s who said to me, "I've been a star for 30 years and I've never made a penny." And that sort of inspired me to try and make her some money. There was a great number of artists then, and I think it's changed a lot now, but 30, 40 years ago, who had been artists of great repute for many, many years and never, ever made any money, except perhaps when they went out and did gigs. But from recording and writing songs, nothing at all. And so, I enjoyed taking those people on and trying to right those wrongs.
So, for example, Sinead O'Connor, who led, some would say, a somewhat tragic life because there was a lot going on in her head that
Well,
couldn't
of
be.
course, Sinead came to me. I mean, she'd had ups and downs, and of course, she'd been absolutely huge, and then gone on Saturday Night Live and torn out a picture of the Pope, and everyone in the music business said, "What a stupid thing to do! It's like tearing up your record sales." And I just looked at it when it happened and thought, if I'd been her manager, I would have told her to tear up the bloody picture of the Pope. I mean, you know, you loathe this man, you loathe what he represents. So what do? You don't shoot him. You don't do it American style and go and get a gun. You just tear his photograph up. What a little what a nothing thing to do, to tear a picture up. Just a wonderful statement and fun and amusing. And to just have her career destroyed for doing something like that is extraordinary. And of course, 20 years later, which is when I began managing, or 15 years later, looking back on it, she'd been right. The stories of what had been happening in the church had come out by then, the sexual abuse, and now it didn't look like the wrong thing to have done. And by then, she'd established a new pattern in what she did. She was certainly not going to ever be a pop singer again. And what we tried to do with her was create an artist who represented a sort of a left-wing women's liberalism. And so that anytime there was a big festival going on somewhere in the world, which had that sort of general liberal left-wing attitude, they would want Sinead to head it. And we were quite successful with that. And for a while, that's what she was doing, and very well.
And something I wanted to ask you about, because I'm sure that a lot of people watching and listening today, particularly people like Warren Campbell and Roy Marsden and Phil Kinderman, when you started planning in 1985, it is some time back, but it is still absolutely apocryphal times, where you had this idea of wanting to take what was then Wham to China. What triggered your thinking to do something that clearly had not been done? You didn't even know what obstacles you'd have to face, and then you found what you had to face. How did that whole notion of bringing Wham to China come about?
Well, it was the usual thing of me loving the idea of doing something which hasn't been done, which I haven't done. I mean, I'd like to be doing something new every day. The very first dinner, which my management partner, Jazz Summers, and I had with Wham, which was George, Michael, and Andrew originally, George fixed me with a steely stare and says, "We want to be the biggest group in the world. You've got a year." I burst out laughing, because the biggest group in the world has to be the biggest group in America, because that's 60% of the world market, or was then. And nobody's ever broken America in under 3, 4, 5 years. Even the Beatles were around 5 years before they broke America. And I just laughed, and George said, "Laugh or not?" He said, "You can have a year." And then over the rest of the dinner, and suddenly an idea popped out. I'm not sure who from popped out a bottle of wine, I think. Why not make Wham the first group ever to play in communist China? And George seemed to like that. He said, "Right, fix that." And I thought, this is wonderful, because A, I love Asia, and I could now go off to Asia and leave my partner Jazz Summers in London to deal with the boring work. And B, it was a completely impossible task which no one had ever done or even dreamt could be done. That's the sort of thing I like. So that's what I went off and did, and it took me 18 months. And we're actually now just about starting to make a film about it. It was for the 40th anniversary next year, there'll be a film out, which we're just starting work on right now.
So would it be accurate to say that at that time there had not been a Western or European or British rock band or rock pop act?
Pop act? No pop music. You know, pop music, even within Western cultures, is very subversive. I mean, every bit of subversion and new thinking and change usually comes out of youth and youthful music. And no one was more aware of this than China, and they were terrified of their own youth music, leave alone overseas youth music. And so I had to talk to them, and I said to them, look, if you invite Wham to come and play in China, you can keep it quiet. I don't care. I'm not even interested. If anyone in China knows that they're playing here, we're interested in the world's press knowing, and that will make them huge in America, and we can break them in America in a year, which is what I've been commissioned to do. But we want them here in China, and for the world's press to know they're here in China. And on your part, if you do that, the whole world will think you're opening up. No one would believe that you've got Wham in China, other than you really are opening up and freeing the country from its past, and you're no longer afraid of youth culture and subversiveness. And so they went along. I was going to say they fell for it, but it was better than that. They went along with it, and a great deal of what's there now in modern China comes from that gig and the influence of that gig, and many other things too. But it certainly did. The youth of China did begin to realize that there were freedoms available to them they hadn't had before.
So when they played that arena, that stadium in China, were there many punters that came to see the show? What was the attendance there?
Well, it was full because, that's the way things are done in China. You have a concert, you fill it up. Most of the people there were people who'd worked hard on their collective farm and were therefore given the permission to go and buy a ticket. What worried us was that they wouldn't really have money for tickets. And also they wouldn't know who the group was or what they were going to see. I mean, they knew they were going to see they knew they were going to be allowed to see a foreign group. They loved that. But so I had a cassette made of all Wham songs sung in Mandarin, which we gave away with the tickets, so they'd all know the songs and sort of know what it was they were going to see.
Great idea to do that. Great idea to do that. And that familiarized them to a certain extent so that when Wham played, did people actually recognize the material?
Well, it was more than that. It was just that we knew there was going to be over 200 foreign journalists and press there. And I'd lied. They'd said, why were Wham invited to China? And I said, because they're the biggest group in China. We've made them huge. Guess why they're invited? And of course, nobody in China had ever heard of them. And I thought, I'm going to have egg on my face when they all arrived and realized no one in the audience knows the songs. So I thought if we could get the audience to learn a few songs first, it would help. So that was the real reason I did it.
And it did, in fact, reverberate all over the world, where you got a lot of coverage over the fact that you'd basically opened a door that had never been opened before.
Well, yes, that's wonderful. But what I was doing very, self-centered. What we wanted was to break Wham in America very quickly. And within 3 months of that stadium gig in America, they had been on NBC, CBS, ABC News 24/7 for a week. Within 3 months, we were doing a stadium tour of America. Not quite within the year I'd been given, but pretty close.
But you and Jazz Summers worked so well together. Jazz was an interesting original in his own right, loved jazz, of course, as it was, and he passed away a few years ago, unfortunately, but that was a happy managerial linkage for you, wasn't it?
It was a wonderful linkage. Jazz was as different from me as anyone could ever be. I mean, he was aggressive and confrontational and liked to fight and liked to provoke people. And I'm the opposite. I like to go to any lengths to try and solve things peacefully and quietly. And we both understood each other and how to use each other's qualities. And he was as wonderful, an incredible, wonderful, liberal man. There was a wonderful occasion after we stopped managing Wham, and he had to go around to EMI one time to see a A&R man about something, and he went in to see the current head of A&R at EMI. And at the time, Jazz was married to Yaz, who he later had a hit with, the singer. And he went in to see the head of EMI, and the head of EMI, who I'm not going to name, was grumbling, or head of A&R at this label, anyway, was grumbling. He said, "Oh, he said the whole industry is being taken over by niggers and queers." And Jazz leapt forward, grabbed him by the lapels, banged his head against the wall, and said, "Well, my wife's a nigger and my partner's a queer." And he shoved him in a cupboard, it's on the third floor, slammed the door shut, locked it with a key, and threw the key out the window. And the guy was found there 18 hours later by the cleaning ladies.
Oh my
Well,
God.
by then well soiled as well.
That is incredible that you could
And
get away.
you know, Jazz could be a wonderful, hot-tempered man.
That is really incredible. Tell us about, you did a little bit of work with Paul McCartney's brother, Mike McGear, who was in the Scaffold, correct?
Yes, I'm charming. What a lovely group to work with. Yes. Yeah, well, it's something which came to when I was producing records with my partner, then record producing partner, Ray Singer, back in 1967. And we were asked if we do a couple of tracks with the Scaffold, who'd had that hit. Thank you very much. Very big. Mike McGear and a couple of other people who names have slipped off our mind. How embarrassing. Yeah, I mean, it was rather fun because one got to do what other people dream of doing. You know, Mike said, "Oh, come up to Liverpool and discuss it." And you sat in the kitchen in his house, which was Paul McCartney's house, where they'd been. They hadn't moved out yet, and the family was still in there. So it was what now is a listed building, I think. And you go on package tours, and we sat in the kitchen, and there was the family stuff around us.
So another interesting thing that you did is for a while you spent a year in Australia working for Albert Productions, the great production company in Australia that actually had the Easy Beats, which then led to them also getting AC/DC.
That's right. I got to Australia. And my plan in Australia, I'd got bored of the music industry. Like I said, I get bored of things very quickly. And I'd been the manager of the Yardbirds, and I'd had a hit with "You Don't Have to Say You Love Me" with Dusty Springfield. And I thought, I'm fed up. That's enough music business. I'll go and do something else now. And I went off to Australia with this plan. Maybe now it's time to do something else. And sat around for a week. And then I saw an advertisement in a newspaper for a television presenter. So I went along. I thought I'd apply for that. That'd be something different. And it turned out they wanted someone for a children's TV show. They wanted Uncle Grumpy for a children's TV show.
Uncle Grumpy.
And I wasn't good enough. I couldn't grump enough, or they decided I was not going to make the grade as Uncle Grumpy. And then they asked me what I'd done. I was talking to them, and they found out I was a record producer and manager. And so they said, "Oh, will I do the music for the show?" And of course, I was stuck. I was back doing what I'd always done. Within a month, I was doing music for 2 or 3 television shows and producing records. So I resigned myself to the fact I was going to be in the music business again, and started producing records with Australian artists at the moment. And I came into contact with a company called Albert Records, where Easy Beats had Harry Vander and George Young, 2 guys who had this group called the Easy Beats, who's had several hits in the UK and in America. And
Young is the older brother of Angus Young from AC/DC.
Yeah, there were 2 George Youngs. So there was George. Yeah, there were 3 young brothers, weren't there? George was the older brother of Angus. Right. And what had happened is they'd stopped having hits with Easy Beats, but continued to write songs. And Albert Publishing was stuck with having to pay them a large advance every year for songs which were no longer being hits. So Ted Albert, who ran Albert, said, it'd be really nice if you could spend a little time trying to get some hits with these songs. And he handed me these demos, incredible catalogue of unknown songs. And so I just scoured around Australia, finding artists who could sing these songs, and we got hits. It wasn't very difficult because, Harry and George wrote amazingly good songs.
And you found John Paul Young.
Me being lazy again. One of the songs which Harry and George played me, it's a song called Pasadena, and it was just a demo they'd made. They just made it with a drum loop, and George sang along on it, and very, very simple. It just sounded like a hit to me, just like it was. I couldn't think it needed much changing. In fact, I couldn't understand why they didn't just put it out as the Easy Beats, but they didn't want to. And I said, "Oh, this will be a hit for sure." And I persuaded Ted Albert, who owned the company, that it needed a good studio to remake it, and the best studio was in Melbourne. We were in Sydney. The best studio is in Melbourne. And so he booked that studio for me. And I said, we need some strings. You need the Melbourne Symphony. So he booked the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. And he said, who's going to sing it? And I said, oh, it'll be no problem at all. It's not a very difficult song. I'll find a singer. And in those days, Sydney, unlike now, was a hotbed of music and clubs. Every single night there was a pub, half a dozen pubs with clubs and singers. And I was back there last year, and it's just not like that anymore, which is very sad. And I said, I'll find one, don't worry. And I forgot all about it. And then eventually, a couple of weeks later, Ted Albert called me up and said, we're all ready for tomorrow. And I'd forgotten. And so I had to rush off and find a singer. And I thought, well, it won't be a problem. I looked in the music paper, and it was Wednesday night. Wednesday night was the one night all the pubs closed. And the only place I could find with some music going on was way out of town, Newcastle, which is a long way on the train. Or is it Liverpool? I can't remember. There's funny places outside of Sydney.
Right.
And off I went on the train for an hour, and I got there, and there was this appalling, dreadful, dirty, smelly pub. And I walked in, and it stank of vomit and beer, and I backed outwards and stood on the balcony. And there was a young guy there smoking a cigarette. And I said, God, it's awful in there, isn't it? He said, yeah, I've got to go and sing there in a minute. I said, oh, you're a singer? And he said, yeah. And I said, you're any good? And he said, oh, I think I'm all right. And he looked quite nice, and he seemed confident. So I handed him a cassette, and I handed him an air ticket. In those days in Australia, air tickets didn't have names on them. You just booked a ticket like a train ticket. So I handed him an air ticket, and I handed the cassette. I said, if you learn this and come to Melbourne tomorrow, we'll make a hit record with you. And I left, because I couldn't face going back in there. So I was either not going to have a singer, or I have to have someone I didn't know. And I flew down to Melbourne the next day. We did this, put on the Melbourne Symphony, and made the track sound wonderful. And Ted Albert kept saying to me, what's the singer like? Is he any good? Oh, he's fantastic. You won't believe how good he is. But I hadn't a clue. My heart was, I was nervously waiting for the afternoon. But absolutely on 3 o'clock on the dot, the door of the studio opened, and John Paul Young walked in. We were in the control room, and he walked right through the studio in front of us through the glass window, right through the studio, and halfway through the studio, I said, on the talk back, I said, stop there, John. I didn't even know his name, actually. I didn't do this, stop there, John. I just said, stop there. And the mic was there, and he sang it in one take, absolutely, just perfectly. That was it. And we had it on the radio the next night. The advantage of Ted Albert was he owned radio stations. He owned two U2, I think it's U2, in Sydney. So the very same evening, we had it on the radio. And by the end of the week, it was a hit. So that was John Paul Young up and running.
Amazing. And in terms of what you did with Japan, tell us a little bit about that long relationship of 7 years with Japan, and creatively, how did it appeal to you?
Well, it's just the underdog thing, and when somebody they were a difficult group. They sang difficult music, and they got. I heard them. It's really strange when you see somebody you think is stunning and fantastic, and everyone will recognize as stunning and fantastic. Then everybody says they're not, because A&R people. You said there was an eminent A&R person watching. Oh dear, I'm going to be rude about A&R people, but A&R people usually haven't a clue what's needed. I remember when Aha, that Norwegian group, had a hit. And the next week, every A&R person in England flew to Norway looking for the next group. If a Norwegian group has a hit this week, then the next group's going to come from Afghanistan. I mean, for God's sake, don't look in the same place. And so when you have a group like Japan and they come along with something interesting, and everyone is saying, oh, they're not like anything we've heard before. Well, that's exactly what's going to be a big group. But it took me 7 years to persuade people. And I became entrenched, and I really wasn't going to give up. And we got these extraordinary rejections right at the beginning. I remember we had this, what I thought was an amazingly good-looking group, playing very interesting music, wonderful lyrics. David Sylvie wrote those fantastically good lyrics. I remember the first song he sang me, so she keeps her love in a carrier bag. I thought that's got to be a #1. Um, and we got, I remember one of the rejections we got was from somebody who said, it was from the head of A&R at CBS said, this group have great potential, but unfortunately we're not in the potential business. I thought that summed up the dumb-wittedness of A&R people. And another one said the bass player needs to learn the play the bass. That was Mick Kahn, who's later recognized as one of the best players of the 80s, 70s. But we stuck at it. And then I broke them in Japan eventually. And on the earnings from their success and stardom in Japan, we kept them going for 3-4 years till we finally broke them in London.
It's so interesting, just looking at some of the other people that are joining in on this. Anne Murray, welcome. It's great to see you here. Annette Valentine, Antonio Hyder, also Barry Taylor. Good to see your name there, Barry. Colin Wallace, Dan Mackey, David Owen. Just great to see some of these professionals. Tell us about your writing, Simon, because you've now written
I better
5.
stop being rude about them, and I love A&R people. Sorry all about it. There are some great A&R people, of course. Just there are some nitwits. So there are some nitwit managers too. So there we are.
The R&R people versus the A&R people.
There are some wonderful A&R people, and I've met many of them. And there are some awful managers. So now we're all balanced up. What was the next thing about what?
About
writing?
writing. You've written 5 or 6 books now, right?
Books. Well, that was sort of what I always thought I ought to do when I was young. I mean, I gave up. You started off asking me about when I played the trumpet and went off to America to be a jazz musician when I was 18. By the time I was 21, I realized, I was only going to be an average musician. I could play in a band, but, I wanted to be Buddy Rich or Count Basie. I didn't want to be the third trumpet in a band or something like that. So once I realized I wasn't going to be some sort of superstar, I just thought I didn't want to give that up, do something else. And I didn't know what. So I hitchhiked, and I just hitchhiked around America. I was 19, I was 20. And, I used to be very neat and tidy and carry all my things in a little bag and stand politely by the side of the road with my thumb out. And hitchhiking wasn't very big at all in those days. There was very little of it going on. And if anyone would pick me up, they'd get this polite Englishman who discuss, well washed and nice and clean, and discuss anything they wanted to discuss with them. But I used to despair a bit. I mean, I was passionately into books. I just stood by the road reading books. In fact, I often missed getting lifts because I got so engrossed in a book I forgot to put the thumb out. And I think I was very into the Beats at the moment at that time. So I was reading Jack Kerouac and John Recchi and read poetry by Ferlinghetti. And I decided I should be a writer. And that really wasn't so much a decision as an opting out of having to decide what it is I ought to do for myself. Because I figured if you're going to be a writer, all you've got to do is live for 10 years and then you have something to write about. So it wasn't urgent, because if you're going to be a writer, you can't be a writer at 20. You need to get to at least 30 before you've got anything to write about. And it didn't matter what you did, because anything you did for the next 10 years. So that sort of let me off the hook. I no longer had to think about what did I have to do. And so first of all, I thought I'd hitchhike to every state. You could do it in those days because Alaska wasn't a state, Hawaii wasn't a state. You actually could hitchhike them. I got to 44. I missed out on 4. And then when I wasn't sure what to do, I just thought, follow your dick, because at 18 or 20, it's pretty opinionated. And so the next few years, that's sort of what I did. I allowed it to dominate my choices in life. When it stood up and pointed, I followed. And that led me to the music business.
Incredible. I'm very pleased to see we have Howie Singer as one of our audience today. Howie is a wonderful, wonderful technologist and creative technologist, and really is well known for the work that he did with Warner Music, just really introducing the digital world into it. People like John Horn. John, welcome. Mark Cates, great to see you here on the show as well, Mark. And also we have Michael Hosking. Michael, I think, is from Singapore. He's a concert promoter in Singapore. So we've definitely got a good multinational grouping. And Nita Raghuwanshi, just a wonderful, wonderful publisher from New York City, a remarkable woman and a great professional. Nita, great to see you on the show today. Peter Smith from Holland. boy, have we got this is the United Nations and the United Mutations. This is really great.
You say United Mutations? Did you say?
That's right.
Is that what you said?
That's right. But the various books that you wrote, the stimulus for the various books, because just give us the titles of the books in order that you wrote.
Well, the first book was You Don't Have to Say You Love Me. And later on, I thought I shouldn't have called it that, but it doesn't really matter. Because as a song title, you know how to phrase it, because you all know the song. So you say, you don't have to say you love me, because that's how the phrase sings. But of course, when you see it as a book title, you see you don't have to say you love me, which sort of has a slightly different nuance. But I wrote that because I really needed to get started. If I was going to be a writer, I suddenly realized I got to 40 and I hadn't written a book, and that's what I'd been planning to do.
Right.
Thus, I followed my dick, as I said, in the music business, and then I'd followed money and groups and artists and music and fun, lots of fun, and food and drink. And now I'd got to 40 and I hadn't done that sensible thing I had to do in my life. So it's time to write a book. And I thought the easy way to write a book would be to write short stories, because it's less daunting than sitting down with, 100,000 words to write. You've got 5,000 words to write. And when you've done that, you do another one. And so I divided sort of what I wanted my life up to then, I suppose, into, I thought through it and divided it into 40 little episodes, which allowed me to think of it as short stories rather than one long thing, and settle down to write them. And I look back on it now, it's not nearly as well written as what I write now. I didn't write as well, but it was very funny and incredibly sacrilegious. I mean, I didn't hold back. I mean, I think at the time I thought that's the end of the music business. Now I'll write. So it didn't matter what I said and what I said about anybody. And I wrote a lot of things I don't think I'd write now. And also, extraordinary, although it doesn't seem that long ago, it was 1983, so 17, so for 40, nearly 50 years, mores and morals have changed. I mean, things I said in there can't be said now. And there were remarks, words used. I mean, my feelings have never changed, but we used words, racist words or sexist words, which now really can't be used, which are extremely offensive now. One of which I used earlier in telling a story, but I didn't know how else to tell the story. But you know, I had to do the audiobook of it recently, and I found it very difficult to read it because, okay, it's written, it's a piece of history. I'm not going to rewrite the book or change it for publication, but actually just sit there and read out some of these things which now you wouldn't say felt very awkward. But I did it. I thought to change it would be the wrong thing.
And in terms of the more recent books that you've written, just tell us what you've recently.
Well, the second book, it's definitely, in terms of a good bit of writing, Black Powder, White Powder, which is really, my idea was the history of the British record business. But allowing that as a record business, it really only started in 1950, because prior to that, the music business was run around sheet music, when sheet music was the charts, and that's what everything was guided towards selling hit songs and selling the sheet music. From 1950 to rock and roll onwards, it became the records. And so the record industry really came of age in 1948 to 50. And I wrote that as a British thing. And I spent a lot of time on it. I mean, I really did spend a year and a half. And when I say a lot of time writing, it wasn't a lot of time researching. It was just endless writing, polishing, trying to make it read extremely well. And I look back at it now. I mean, it does read very well. It's probably the best book I've written in terms of writing fluency. But then after that, I was pressured and pushed non-stop. You've got to write a book about Wham, about Wham, about Wham. And I never wanted to, because, however you think about Wham, they were a teenage group. They were two 18-year-olds. Unless you're going to do a complete analysis of how the industry works and what teenage music represents in the industry, it seemed to be, it would be quite a boring book. And I didn't want to do that sort of business analysis of the industry. And just writing about just Wham as two kids just seemed to be very tabloidish and surface. So in the end, I agreed. I was asked for 5-10 years before I finally agreed. I said, I'll write a book about my life while I managed Wham. So what you're going to get is 3 years when I managed Wham and it's everything I was doing. So it's about my life and the other people I met and what was going on and how Wham fitted in with my life. And I made it. I mean, it's still half Wham, but to me that was more interesting because it showed, if you like, the life of a manager, a certain person, a certain one manager. But I think most managers would also have their life flowing in and out of the acts they manage in much the same sort of way, different lives, but flowing in the same way. And I enjoyed doing that. And I tried to write it like a novel, so it had good excitement and a pace and didn't feel like a factual book. And I don't know, quite successful, I think.
So here's an interesting question from Ian Warburton, who sent this question in that I'd like to ask you for your reaction to. Who has Simon worked with who has had the clearest understanding of the phenomenon of fame, and who has struggled with it most? Do people know what they're getting into when they start nibbling at the fame monster?
Well, George Michael, who was astonishingly astute and knew exactly how to get what he wanted and planned every single record which Wham would put out so that it enlarged their audience and took it to another level, and planned to leave Wham and move on to his own life, and yet had misjudged that point. And he really hadn't understood how much it would absolutely overwhelm him and how much he'd hate it. On the other hand, someone you didn't mention, who I briefly worked with, was Eartha Kitt. I worked with her much later in life when she was getting a hard time from people she'd signed with who hadn't paid her. And she discussed this very point with me, and how when she was a shy little girl and she sang a song and it became, everybody liked her song. Would you get up on stage and sing it? And she knew at once she couldn't get up on stage and sing like a shy little girl. I mean, she was shoved forwards in a concert hall one night with 2,000 people. And she had no idea what she's going to do. I mean, at that moment, when she's walking out on stage, she's utterly petrified. I cannot stand here and be this shy little girl. What am I going to do? And she suddenly thought of something she'd seen on television or in a film recently about a cat who could sing, some cartoon or something. So she decided she'd be a cat. And everybody loved it. And then she spent the next 15 years of her life trying to integrate the cat lady with the Eartha Kitt who was the shy little girl. And of course, bit by bit, she found that what she'd done when she went out and played that cat on stage was large part of herself, which had been repressed. The show off, the actor part of herself, which she'd never actually seen before. And so it wasn't really taking her in a false direction, but it wasn't quite who she was. And she had to, and she discussed this, I thought, in an extraordinarily perceptive way, and had found this very good balance of being half the two people in one. George found it much more difficult. George, who you'd have thought would really have found it easy because he'd been planning it for so long, hadn't realized exactly how incredibly difficult it would be, not just to be George Michael, who could be an ordinary person and go down to a shop or sit in a restaurant, and that's, everybody finds it difficult. It's immensely difficult to want to be normal, to be able to go out shopping, just to walk, and just sit in a restaurant without 100 people coming rushing across and asking for autographs. It's lovely to be able to get the table when you have a book, but not much fun if you're not going to enjoy sitting at the table because people are coming to bother you. I've seen it with a lot of people. David Sylvian was a great example. David Sylvian came to me with Japan and said, we want to be a huge group and popular. And it took 7 years, as you mentioned earlier. Hugely long, difficult task. And finally, we did break them in a big way. I mean, they were hugely influential. They had 4 hits in a year, and for about 2 years which followed, everyone was copying some aspect of Japan. I mean, Duran's the most obvious example. They took David Sylvian's hairstyle, and all 4 of them became David Sylvian lookalikes. Then Paul Young took Mick Karn's bass playing and made it the basis for all his hits, a fretless bass over which he sang. Gary Newman took David Sylvian's voice, this sort of slurred, slightly tuneless voice, to make it the sound of his hits, Cars. They became hugely influential. And David came to me and said, I don't want to be a star. I hate it. I absolutely don't want to go on another day of being a star. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I want to be like a sort of a minor left bank poet. And I said, well, the problem is, managers of minor left bank poets do almost as much work as for big stars, but they don't get any money. And it's not, I don't see any value in me managing a minor left bank poet. All you've got to do is just sink back into being a reclusive, and you should manage to get there okay, which is sort of what he did.
So here's a question about a book that you wrote, which was called 27 Gone Too Soon, about the
A film I made, not a book I wrote.
A film that you made, I beg your pardon. All about the 27 Club. Just tell us briefly about this. These are people who lost their lives at a fundamentally important part of their career development.
Absolutely fascinating. I was approached to make a film about the 27 Club, which is the 7 or 8 famous, very famous rock stars who died at the age of 27, and Amy Winehouse and I'm sorry, they all slipped out of my mind once, Jimi Hendrix, and oh, they'll come to my mind as I talk. And all your listeners or viewers will know who they are. And my first feeling was it was probably a load of rubbish. You know, it's just coincidences. There are so many rock stars in the world in so many different ages. You could probably pick on any age and find this happened. And then as I researched it, I found it's absolutely the opposite of a load of rubbish, that the frontal lobe in the human brain does not come into maturity, does not develop fully until the age of 27. And the frontal lobe is what gives you cause and effect. And for instance, the special forces, the American, the British Army, French Army, they will not recruit anybody under the age of 27 because they don't have cause and effect. And the army won't recruit private soldiers from anybody over 27 because they do have cause and effect and are going to refuse to run up a beach into machine gun fire with nothing more than a bayonet. And the music industry too really preys on people, young people who don't have cause and effect developed yet and are prepared to give up a university course for the incredible 1 in 1,000 chance of perhaps becoming a pop star. You know, you go to a 27-year-old who's just been through university, got his PhD, and say, will you sign this contract, and show them the average contract which an 18-year-old signs, and they'll say, absolutely no way. So it was very fascinating to find out that 27 is definitely an age when something happens to us, and we start to rethink what we are and where we are and what we're doing. And this causes a lot of inner reflection and suicidal thoughts. And it is an age, not just in rock stars, but if you look at the general population, it's the highest age of suicide amongst all adult men, all adult people. It's an age when everybody has a tendency towards doubting their lives and what they're about, rock stars included. And so it was much more interesting when I came to look at it from that point of view.
Incredible that you zoned in on that topic and found it such a rich field of conjecture and discussion and writing. And you spoke about the Marquee Club that you are shooting at the moment. Did you do something with Elton John and something with Mick Jagger?
Well, waiting on Elton and Mick. Well, Rod Stewart has we're filming him next month. He's agreed. We just did, who did we do last week? We did Rick Wakeman and Tony Banks and a whole host of people. All the names slip out of my mind when you ask me. We've got a wonderful list. John Coghlan from Status Quo. We got a list of about 70 people to film coming up.
That is great. And so, Simon, here you are living most of your life.
Oh, and Phil Collins too, who I did a wonderful interview with. Phil, we went to Switzerland last month and filmed with film. Yeah, and it was wonderful seeing Phil because he hadn't done an interview for a long time and hasn't been well, and he was much better, and it was in every way uplifting. I mean, I think he was uplifted by us going there, but we were too. Because he really is an extraordinarily positive person, and to see him recovering from what he'd been through and coming back and talking about going back in the studio, it was really, really good.
Did he lose his hearing or part of his hearing?
His hearing isn't a major problem. This is his body. He's not moving well, and he hasn't got control over his body, so he can't stand on. He can actually sit down and sing, but he can't stand on stage. He can't play drums.
Well, these are the rigors of an older age that are affecting many musicians, that when they pass the delta of what would have been their great years, and maybe they didn't look after themselves in the way that
Phil was much encouraged to see I had more problem going downstairs to his studio than he did.
Very good. Simon, in terms of your future, you're working on these movies. You obviously have got many more stories and themes that you want to get into your pen and into your pencil. And in terms of looking at what has happened with K-pop, J-pop, now India with I-pop, even Indonesia with indie pop. Are you going to, do you think there's an opportunity of finding stuff in Asia that might be able to cross over in some meaningful form?
Well, I mean, Blackpink's a perfect example. You know, Lisa at Blackpink, you know, said had #1 albums in America. So what I thought would be possible from Thailand a long time ago has now proved to be possible. And you know, Black Eyed Peas have a singer from Philippines, don't they? So I mean, there are Asian people who are happening in America now. It can only grow, and the obvious thing is really China too. I mean, yes, there have been problems with China, but China is so vast and has such a, you know, a hugely young population, and they are, despite the efforts of the Chinese government, very, very much tuned into Western music. I think
Rap,
from China, there'll be a major star from China.
Chinese rap obviously has got a big following in China.
I went 3 or 4 years ago to a huge program. It was the biggest. It was the biggest program, TV program of that year, and it was a rap. It was a bit like an X Factor for rap, and it was a vast show with a vast budget, and was seen by over 100 million people. I mean, it's, you know, you get a country where a minority show is seen by 100 million people. Your audience for rap is bigger than the population of most European countries.
Incredible. Incredible. Trying to see if we've got some other interesting, a couple of questions before we have to start wrapping up. But let's just have a look here. John Horn in the UK, musician and composer. He's happy to be here. Has anyone read Billy Bragg's book about skiffle? Even us old punk.
I had Billy Bragg was one of the people I interviewed for the marquee film. Incredibly good book on skiffle. What I was saying earlier on about the you know, what the importance of skiffle, and he wrote a brilliant 300-page thesis on it. Wonderful book. I advise you all to get it. It is the history of rock music.
He's such a talented individual in his own right, who doesn't get as much credit internationally as he should do. Very interesting guy.
Well, he's equally eloquent on punk, which is his, you know, as he pointed out, skiffle he knew nothing about. He had to research it. So his entire book was based on research. And punk he was able to talk about from his own experience. That was his own skiffle period. And he pointed out that punk groups and punk musicians in the UK, that was the first generation of musicians who hadn't been in skiffle groups. That until then, every single major group had started as a skiffle group, and punks were the first people not to have done.
I think I'm going to call Tom to come in because Tom likes to do the rap on the show, but also it gives us an opportunity to thank him for having ourselves on this. Tom, just great to see you back in the frame here with us, and particularly wanted to ask you to give a big round of thanks to Simon. It's just remarkable and wonderful to have this flow of thinking and creativity that comes so effortlessly from Simon. So, Tom, over to you.
Well, listen, the thanks go to you guys. And you put in the chat a moment ago, you guys are the literal definition of the smartest people in the room. I could sit here for 3 more hours listening to some of this wisdom and these stories. And we really only scratched the surface. I know, Ralph, you always conduct a masterful interview, but Simon, you've got so many more chapters of your amazing career to talk about. Before we do sign off, I want to, note a couple of questions that were in the Q&A that I think are really interesting. One was posted by Saskia, and that is, this is to you, Simon. Do you find writing about taboo issues and experiences helps make great songs?
Taboo. I don't think of anything in the world as taboo, and I dislike things being taboo. And even though a lot of woke thinking suggests that we should make some things and words or attitudes taboo, it's a great pity when that damps down on artistry. And but on the other hand, I don't think you in any way need to look at taboo subjects to write great songs. In the end, the greatest songs come from the most common experiences which we're most likely to have all felt, perhaps put in a different way or seen from a different perspective. But the experiences have got to be shared experiences, or the songs won't be successful. We need art to understand ourselves, which means we must see in it experiences which we have ourselves. And so if it's taboo to the sense that none of us will have ever had or known that experience, it's probably not worth doing. And if it's taboo in the sense that we've always kept it to ourselves and it'd be nice not to, then you should overcome the taboo and write about it.
Amen. Are you writing another book?
It's a long, boring process, Tom. You've got to sit in a room alone for a year. I'm 85. You know, the average age, I think I'm past average age for death. So if I live another year, I could spend the whole year locked in a room alone. If I make movies, I'm out with fun, having fun with people and talking and eating and drinking and planning and plotting. You know, writing books. If I happen to be one of those funny people strange people who manage to live to 90 and keep on going and no more movies to make, maybe you can lock me in a room again and I'll write another book. But you're going to have to wait 5 years.
Awesome. Well, listen, this has been magnificent. I can't thank you both enough for doing it, especially in the latter hours of your evening over there. It's very early on the West Coast. We had several folks from LA tuning in. I'm in Nashville, and a really global audience today. So thank you.
It's true. Ralph and I are both hungry. We were commenting on that before we started, leave alone afterwards.
We're going
For
to have
him now,
together.
it's well, we're a few 1,000 miles apart, but it's 10 o'clock for us, both of us.
Well, we'll turn you loose to go have a great meal on me. To the audience, you got yourself a real treat today and you started your day off right. So go off and do well, be nice to everybody you come in contact with today in honor of these two international ambassadors of goodwill. All the best, folks.
Thanks so much for everything, Tom. Great to be on this. And Simon, to you, what can we say? A massive vote of thanks, and you definitely get.
Well, thank you, Rob. I mean, I planned that we were going to have a conversation, and in the end, you just asked me questions, and I just gabbled all over you. Sorry about that. But when we have dinner, the conversation is more free flowing, isn't it?
Yes, it is always interesting and fascinating. Tom, thank you.
Cheers,
Thanks,
boys.
Tom.
Safe
Bye.
travels.